Mr. President, on Sunday, October 22, 2023, more than 2 million Venezuelans around the world made their voices heard and cast their votes in support of Maria Corina Machado, the official opposition candidate for the upcoming presidential elections. These brave Venezuelans participated in this election at great personal risk, but did so united by their dedication to ridding Venezuela of the brutal oppression brought onto them by Nicolas Maduro and returning freedom and democracy to their country. This is a significant moment in the Venezuelan people's fight for freedom and true representative government, something I've been fighting alongside them to achieve for years. It is imperative that the United States stand with them, recognize Maria Corina Machado as Venezuela's duly elected presidential opposition candidate, and lead the international community in doing the same. The National Primary Commission is to be commended for its ability to successfully organize and carry out the opposition primary election despite facing numerous obstacles, threats, and attacks from the illegitimate Maduro regime. The work of the National Primary Commission advances the cause of freedom in Venezuela and represents the best interests of its citizens. It also is in our national security interest and the best interest of all who strive for peace, liberty, and stability for nations in Latin America and across the Western Hemisphere to recognize and support the fundamental role the Commission is carrying out in Venezuela. The United States must use this opportunity to put the full weight and power of our nation behind the cause of freedom in Venezuela. Our national security depends on us being strong in this moment. However, we cannot act from a position of strength while negotiating with a murderous, dishonest, and tyrannical dictator. I have been unequivocal in my condemnation of attempts to negotiate with Nicolas Maduro on any issue beyond how and when he will leave power. Recently, I wrote to President Biden urging him to acknowledge this moment and immediately revise the conditions of sanctions relief that the administration has recently offered to the Maduro regime. That is the only way to make clear that Maduro and his thugs, who have horrifically murdered and oppressed the Venezuelan people for years, will see no easing of sanctions until free and fair elections are held and democracy returns to Venezuela and the following conditions are met. Number one, Maria Corina Machado, as the sole presidential opposition candidate, should be represented on the opposition delegation of the Venezuelan-led negotiations in Barbados. Number two, Maria Corina Machado is officially allowed to run as the sole presidential candidate of opposition in the 2024 Venezuelan presidential election. Number three, the release of all political prisoners, including all U.S. citizens, by the illegitimate Maduro regime. It's hard to believe that we're negotiating with somebody that is holding American citizens. Number four, reputable election observers are allowed to witness the illegitimate Maduro regime, permitting international election observers from the Organization of American States, the European Union, the International Republican Institute, and the National Democratic Institute to ensure that the electoral process is genuinely free, fair, and transparent. And finally, number five, recognize the votes of the Venezuelan diaspora in the 2024 Venezuelan presidential election. Just a few days after Maria Corina Machado's big win in the 2023 presidential elections, we're already seeing Nicolas Maduro, Diosdado Cabello, Jorge Rodriguez, and their thugs threatening, harassing, and attacking the National Primary Commission and everyone who voted for her and the hopes she represents. Days after the election, the Maduro regime's handpicked Supreme Court declared the suspension of, quote, all effects of the Venezuelan primaries. We must all see this for exactly what it is, a clear sign that Maduro's true intentions is to never give up his power or allow freedom to return to Venezuela. Lifting sanctions on the illegitimate regime of Nicolas Maduro and permitting the sale of oil and gas would essentially fund Maduro's 2024 presidential campaign, further empowering the regime, prolonging oppression and genocide, and propping terrorism and narco-trafficking in the region. President Biden has a historic opportunity to be a part of the recovery of democracy in Venezuela and to stand up for freedom and democracy, values that define us as Americans. I'm here today to ask unanimous consent for the passage of a resolution where the Senate recognizes Maria Corina Machado as Venezuela's official presidential opposition candidate and commending her for standing up against Maduro and leading the charge for freedom and democracy in Venezuela. That is not easy. Condemns efforts by the illegitimate Maduro regime to prevent Maria Corina Machado, Venezuela's duly chosen official presidential opposition candidate, from participating in Venezuela's presidential election of 2024, rejects the illegitimate Maduro regime's efforts to carry out fraudulent presidential elections by barring the participation of the opposition candidate chosen by the Venezuelan voters, demands that the illegitimate Maduro regime permits election observers from the OAS, the European Union, the International Republican Institute, and the National Democratic Institute, calls on the illegitimate Maduro regime to immediately release all political prisoners, including all U.S. citizens, denounces efforts by the illegitimate Maduro regime to persecute members of the National Primary Commission, calls on the United States government and the international community to institute greater pressure and tighten sanctions against the illegitimate Maduro regime in order to restore freedom in Venezuela. This is common sense, but more importantly, it's the right thing to do for America's national security and unapologetic support of freedom and democracy for all people. Mr. President, I ask you unanimous consent to address the Senate in Spanish.
Without objection.
Más de 2 millones de venezolanos votaron por un cambio y ni Maduro y su régimen ilegítimo van a cambiar eso. El presidente Biden y la comunidad internacional deben reconocer a María Corina como la líder legítima de la oposición venezolana y trabajar con ella para recuperar la democracia y libertad de Venezuela. He sido muy claro, no se debió hacer ningún acuerdo con Maduro y no se pueden levantar sanciones hasta que sepamos que María Corina está habilitada y las elecciones sean completamente libres y transparentes. No al revés. Mr. President, I am thankful for the support of my colleagues from Florida, Senator Rubio, and the companion resolution is being introduced in the House by Congressman Diaz-Balart. I urge all my colleagues to adopt this important resolution today. As if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of Senate Resolution 486, which is at the desk. I further ask the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Reserving the right to object. Mr. President, first I want to thank my colleague from Florida for bringing this issue to the floor. I have spoken frequently about the tragedies of the Maduro regime, the protracted political, economic, and human rights crisis that has been caused by the Maduro regime. 7 million Venezuelans have left their homes. The Maduro regime is under investigations for crimes against humanity, and the list goes on and on and on and on. I have the opportunity to chair the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. This is a resolution that should go through our committee. Our committee should have an opportunity to review and offer suggestions as to what should be included and how it's worded. And for that reason alone, I would have concern about how it's moving forward. But let me add just a few more parts to this. I support the administration's efforts to pursue diplomatic engagement. By strategically leveraging U.S. sanctions, the administration has empowered Venezuela's democratic opposition in its negotiations to this regime. We impose sanctions so that we can get changes of actions to those who we impose the sanctions against. When we see progress in that regard, we should be willing to modify or eliminate those sanctions. And on October the 17th in Barbados, the unitary platform and the Maduro regime reached an agreement. They created a roadmap for more competitive presidential elections next year. By supporting this agreement, the Biden administration has provided political space for the political opposition to hold primaries on October 22nd. The results were resounding, as my colleague from Florida has pointed out. Maria Corina Machado won the opposition primaries with over 90% of the vote. That's an impressive victory. This is the kind of progress that has been desperately needed to help restore democracy in Venezuela. Of course, the Maduro regime has sought to undermine the results of the primary. We're not surprised by that. The Biden administration has made it clear if the Maduro doesn't allow the candidate to run, they will reimpose the sanctions. That's how it should work. And if it does not release the political prisoners and wrongfully detained Americans, the United States will snap back our sanctions. We've made that very clear. We want our political prisoners and wrongfully detained Americans released immediately. They should never have been detained. We want to make sure there's a competitive election in Venezuela. And if it's not, we will reimpose our sanctions. So, and I've called for these competitive elections. As I pointed out, this resolution has not been considered by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It comes as negotiations remain underway and some initial advancements have taken place. It seeks to dictate action to the administration as sensitive diplomatic negotiations are ongoing. The Biden administration has already stated publicly it will reimpose sanctions if the Maduro regime does not follow through on their commitments. We know we don't trust them. Believe me, we don't. And we have the opportunity to reimpose those sanctions. We must maintain the diplomatic space needed to advance democratic elections. That's our objective. Our objective is to get democratic elections and to secure the release of the wrongfully detained Americans and political prisoners. So I would suggest to my colleagues, submit his resolution for consideration to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. That's why we have the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Give us a chance for the input of those of us who have been working on this Venezuelan issue for a long time. Give us the opportunity for input. That's how the system is supposed to work. And I give my colleague the assurances, I want to take this up in the Foreign Relations Committee. I want to see a resolution passed on the floor of the Senate in regards to what's happening in Venezuela, and I certainly will work with my colleague in that regard. And for the reasons I've stated, Mr. President, I object.
Mr. President.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Florida.
So I thank my colleague for his comments about the importance of making sure that we get free and fair elections in Venezuela. And it sounds like this is just a procedural issue. There doesn't appear to be, right now, at least any issue over the substance of the resolution. And I look forward to my colleague scheduling a Foreign Relations Committee markup for this important resolution. And so hopefully we'll get to the point where we have real free and fair elections. Hopefully we'll get to the point where we get these Americans back. Hopefully all the things that I think both of us care about are going to happen. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, shortly we will be voting on Elizabeth Richard to be the State Department's coordinator for counterterrorism, the motion in regards to invoking cloture. And I speak in favor of her nomination as the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We need someone at the helm of our civilian and diplomatic efforts on counterterrorism who has the experience of working in some of the most dangerous and challenging environments. We need someone who's qualified to direct and successfully implement the department's counterterrorism programs and who can work hand in hand with the Department of Defense on counterterrorism issues. We also need someone who has proven they will stand up for American values. The threat from terrorism has not gone away, but has changed dramatically. Not only has terrorism spread across more countries, but today it takes on a different form. Protecting our nation from the evolving counterterrorism threat is absolutely critical to the security of the United States. That is why we must have an experienced leader at the helm of the Bureau of Counterterrorism, and why we must confirm Ambassador Richard without delay. Ambassador Richard has over 3 decades of experience in foreign service. She has served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Near East Affairs at the Department of State, as Deputy Chief of Mission in Yemen, as Border Coordinator in Pakistan, and as Ambassador to Lebanon, a career diplomat who served our nation. Throughout her tenure, she has led efforts with our partners and allies to confront the challenges from terrorist groups. Ambassador Richard's nomination was reported out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee by a voice vote. She has overwhelming endorsements from military and civilian leaders alike, including the support of some of our most experienced and senior national security officials. From General Vodal, a retired 4-star general and former commander of Special Operations Command and Central Command, to General Nagata, former commander of Special Operations Command Central and Director of Strategy for the National Counterterrorism Center, to retired Major General Fontes of the U.S. Army Cyber Commands. All endorse her candidacy, as does Jeffrey Feltman, the former Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs of the United Nations, Assistant Secretary for Near East Affairs and U.S. Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa, as has Ann Patterson, former U.S. Ambassador to Pakistan, Egypt, Colombia, and Assistant Secretary for Near East Affairs. I could go on. Ambassador Richard has earned the support because of her long career. They all speak highly of her ability and qualifications to lead the department's counterterrorism policy. As one of them said, she is, quote, among the very finest diplomats our nation has produced. I have every confidence she will leave the CT Bureau with distinction. This is a serious position and demands someone with the experience and caliber of Ms. Richards possesses. She has the skill, knowledge, and capacity to meet the challenges that lie ahead. I urge my colleagues to support her nomination. With that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.